Okay, this is landmark 1. If you really want to be in landmark 2, you have to go out the door and around that way. Don't ask me why it's set that way, but it is. And this is a panel on voting rights. And the first thing I need to do is to tell you that our panel doesn't look exactly like it looks in the program. We did hope that Nellie Gorbea, who is Secretary of State in Rhode Island and the treasurer of the Democratic Association of Secretaries of State, would be joining us. Hi, how are you? You can join us as we go through this. Would be here for a different presentation that she hoped to make, and then we added her into this panel because it'd be good to hear from a current Secretary of State from someplace else what's going on, but she was not able to make it. We always have the challenge of people think that they're just going to fly into Portland and do something for us and fly back again. When she figured out the extra that this would take to do, it wasn't really possible for her to manage to do that. But she does have relatives and lots of friends in Oregon, and you might see her. She's running for governor of Rhode Island, and you might see her come through, and I suggest you support her if you get a chance, even though she wasn't able to be here with us. So, and then, unfortunately, Representative Diego Hernandez had a back injury yesterday, and thinking, oh, it'll be better tomorrow. They never are, those kinds of things. And so last I talked to him, he was in urgent care. I think Representative Fahey also has been in touch with him. So we're hoping to transition, and we are very grateful that Representative Julie Fahey was willing to step in and has talked with him a little bit about what he hoped to talk about. I'll introduce the panel members and give a little bit more bios of them as we get to that. But I'm always reminded I need to say who I am. I'm Jeanne Atkins, immediate past chair of the Democratic Party of Oregon, formerly your Secretary of State and State Director for Senator Merkley, formerly a lot of things, and currently nothing. Very, very happy, but happy to pitch in when it's needed, and especially to say what I know and what I think. Our panel sort of starts with the premise that we are very proud of Oregon's progress in improving electoral participation. We were one of the first states, of course, to adopt vote by mail and online voter registration, which some states still don't have, believe it or not, and the very, very first in the country to implement automatic voter registration. And we also recognize that at least to date, with the leadership that we have in our legislature and our statewide offices, we haven't experienced and are not likely to experience the kind of retrograde proposals that other states are experiencing, where pathway to the ballot, pathway to vote, for voter registration such as voter ID are unlikely to be on our horizon. That's something we need to always keep in mind as we look towards the future and our own elected leadership, wherever we should be always watchful, always conscious that there's more to do. And we have panel members, despite all the shakeup, we've got panel members here who don't think the job is done, who think there is more to be done in order to get more participation in our system. And they're actively working and have one project or 2 projects or 23 projects going at any given time that will help to increase the participation of voters in the Oregon electoral system. I'm going to start with, I think just because there's so much important going on about thinking about younger voters, I want to start with Samantha, and I want to give her good introduction, so hang on. I've asked the panelists to think about some sort of basic questions that you might all have about these endeavors, but I also encourage you to ask questions as they're giving their presentations. We should have about 20 minutes each for each of the people there, and then I plan to talk a little bit about automatic voter registration, and I think Representative Fahey's got some things to say about that as well. But what I hoped you would want to know is, you know, why is this work important? How are the projects that they're working on going to help us accomplish the goal of greater participation? Where do those projects stand in either the legislative process or some other campaign that they're working on? What are the barriers? Who's pushing back, and why might there be pushing back? Who do we need to listen to on that front? And how can activist Democrats such as yourself be helpful? How can you join into all of that? So Samantha Gladu is the executive director of Next Up, and she's going to talk about Next Up. I'm sure a lot of you have been aware for many years of the bus project and the great work that's been done with young, building our leadership and participation by young folks. And under her leadership, they've began to move into the next generation of what that's going to be like. And she came to Oregon politics after completing the program at Portland State that we're all really proud of, called New Leadership Oregon. I think that may be where I first met you. Is being brought around to the Capitol to meet various people and understand our system. She has a degree in community development, a background in reproductive health advocacy, and she also has caused me to give widely to the access to abortion funds, national funds, that's so important at this time. She's worked on issues globally at the United Nations and as Planned Parenthood Global Youth Advocacy Fellow, regionally as a board vice president for the Northwest Abortion Access Fund. She serves as a member of the NARAL Pro-Choice Oregon Board of Directors and was a founding board member and co-director of the New Leaders Council in Portland. And another thing I love about her, when she's not working to make the world a better place, I think this still does make the world a better place. Samantha's playing bass in her feminist punk band. She's cuddling her dog Pierre, who's joining us today, or sampling the best of Oregon's food, wine, and beer with her spouse, Zach. So I would like you to welcome Samantha Gladu to talk about Next Up and what we need to know.
Thanks, Jeanne. I'm going to return to this chair with Tony and Rep Fahey down here. I was saying just a few moments ago that I finally made it onto a panel with Jeanne Atkins, and I peaked. It's over now. Goal accomplished. So I'm going to keep this brief because, just kidding. But yeah, so as Jeanne mentioned, I'm the executive director of Next Up. We were known as the Bus Project for like 16 years, 17 years. And we needed to change because we've evolved a lot, and we've moved to being centered around values now instead of a bus. And we still mobilize young voters, we still develop bold leaders, and we still achieve systems change. Now we are completely values driven by things like youth focused and youth led, justice for all, collaboration and innovation, and authenticity and joy. And we've evolved from being a majority white organization to a multicultural, anti-racist organization that is 50% Black, Indigenous, and people of color and entirely under 35, which is very fun. And it positions our North Stars a little bit differently. You know, we're constantly challenging our sense of what is possible. And because we live in Oregon, we are very much looked to as the organization that's setting the agenda for our entire national network of youth organizing groups. So you might remember a thing called the Bus Federation. That's a national group that we started here in Oregon, in Portland more specifically in 2008. They have also rebranded. They're now called the Alliance for Youth Action. And just yesterday, I was with a group of the national executive directors in a place near Albuquerque. We spent the entire week talking about our network strategy, how we're going to go big in 2020 to make sure that young people can show up, and also how we're going to continue our policy platform of democracy done right, which is a thing that we started here with automatic voter registration. It was just a twinkle in our eye and now has expanded to so many states, 17 states and the District of Columbia. And so that's one of the cool things that we've done. We also created a pre-registration program for 16 and 17-year-olds with like about 200,000 16 and 17-year-olds pre-registered, 77 of those through automatic voter registration. We just passed paid postage in 2019 with 42 sponsors, including Rep. Sanchez and Rep. Fahey, thank you. And we did online voter registration back in 2008. And as Jeanne mentioned, not all states have that. Only 37 do, and Oklahoma just passed it. So it's wild out there, you know? Outside of Oregon, things are pretty messed up for voting rights. And here in Oregon, even while we do have all these great policies in play, our victories have really underscored that our wildest dreams are possible, even if it takes multiple generations. We still have a really long way to go. And I wanted to take some time to talk about youth turnout specifically, because we've really got to change the narrative away from young people don't vote, and instead get into young people vote because. Young people vote because we care about our communities. Young people vote because we care about the environment, because we want to see representation who looks like us in our communities. We have 0 state legislators in Oregon under 30, and you have to be 21 to become a state legislator in Oregon. That makes it challenging for us to trust in a system, like elections, like democracy, like politics. However, in 2018, among 18 to 29-year-olds, we saw a huge increase in voter turnout. In 2014, it was about 20%, and that went to 36% in 2018, which is the largest percentage point increase for any group. It's a 79% jump, which is also the highest level of youth participation in at least 25 years. And that's certainly not going to change for 2020. We know, though, that voter registration is going to be the real key. So, you know, people will turn out if they are registered. We have to get them registered, though, and we especially have to focus on getting young people registered, because when young people vote, it's habit forming, and also young people are a major subset of the electorate, and our voices really matter. You know, 46 million young people are eligible, in contrast to 39 million seniors eligible. So young people eclipsing seniors in the voter market, and young people ages 18 to 29 make up 21%, nearly a quarter, of voting eligible population in the United States. That's huge. And our participation influences election results if we are talking about voting in a few ways. It increases the likelihood that other people in our household will vote, and also young people in immigrant communities are easier to reach and are also the most effective messengers in our communities. And we know that some of the things, and you might know these things already, but what affects youth voting are things like contact, especially peer-to-peer. Next Up is so successful because it's young people talking to young people, right? When we do a voter registration drive in a school, people come up to the table, they want to talk to their peers, and it feels more like a collaborative thing and a group think thing and a peer pressure thing, rather than being told to vote by someone who's not in their age group and who maybe has some sort of adult supervisory role over their development or their life. We also know that things like registration, having information, laws that make it easier to vote, civic education, and a home environment are big drivers for young people voting. And that is huge, and we want to do all those things, which is why we're so active in the legislature to make sure that this stuff happens. I mentioned some of the bills that we passed already. Some of the things that we're working on now include paid postage implementation. We want to make sure that it goes off without a hitch for this upcoming 2020 election cycle. Also, we introduced a bill to create an automatic voter registration task force. It did not pass. However, we are absolutely veering into AVR expansion. We're going to be aggressively looking at other agencies. We'd like to expand to higher education, Oregon Health Authority, Department of Human Services, and Department of Corrections. Really would love to expand to all of the agencies, but it will require some investigation about what kind of technology each of them have and what's available. We're also really focused on defending automatic voter registration. You might have seen in the press that there was this $75,000 thing that Tony can maybe talk more about. He helped us fix it. Good job, Tony. And then also voting in jails and at Oregon Youth Authority. We have somebody on our staff now who is an alumni of McLaren Youth Correctional Facility. He did 70 months for a Measure 11 sentence and got out in March. He will be leading on a project with us to do multiple voter registration drives at Oregon Youth Authority facilities in 2020, and then we plan on codifying some of the lessons we learned in the 2021 legislative session. And we're super thankful to Oregon Youth Authority for being a great partner so far. Our North Stars, though, for 2020 and beyond, are things like modernizing the voting age, elections equity, and restoration of rights, or reenfranchisement. And a couple of those things require constitutional ballot measures. So we know that our work is very much cut out for us and are looking at the kinds of small things that we can do to change culture and to make administrative and other legislative moves toward getting as close to those things as we can, so that in a couple generations, you know, similar to AVR, which took 7 years to pass, maybe 7 years from now, people doing time for felonies will be able to vote. Maybe 7 years from now, 16-year-olds will be voting in our general elections. That's our dream, and we're pushing hard on that. And some of the more immediate things that we're looking at include ballots and other elections materials in different languages. We're going to do a big elections equity push in 2021. Also adding demographics to voter registration and candidate filing, so we can actually measure what is happening in terms of political parity with different groups, right? In particular, racial groups. Want to make sure that everybody is participating to the fullest extent possible. Expansion of AVR, which I mentioned. Postmark accepted on election day. We really want to get to that. Voting for 17-year-olds in the primary, if they're going to be 18 in the next election. I think we can do that. Representative Rayfield introduced a bill on that, and Rep. Fahey was a sponsor. So with those two, we can do anything. We also want to update social studies standards and vote on cell phones. Why not? It's happening already this election. Did you see that? 2 counties are piloting absentee ballot voting by cell phone.
For military overseas.
Yeah, it's a very narrow scope, but it's putting us in the right direction toward our utopian dream where we can truly vote from anywhere, right? But yeah, so that's kind of what we're working on, and ways that you can help. I want to put in a plug. I could do it later, or I could do it now. I know I've been talking for a minute.
That's all right.
Yeah? Okay. So I think that the top 4 things that y'all can do for pushing voting rights forward are to demand racial equity. So you need to work on your analysis and your community. This is something that we all need to do to make sure that this work is more welcoming and accessible. You know, Representative Hernandez has done so much and definitely cannot be the only voice pushing for elections equity. We all need to. And we all need to open up this field toward having more people in it, which means doing the work. And also, we need to resource young people to do the work. Remind everyone to register and vote. That's an easy thing, you all do. And do everything you can to elect a Secretary of State who will be bold and effective. Those are my top 4 recommendations for increasing voting rights.
Wonderful. I'll bet you folks have 1,000 questions. I do. I'm sorry. I would. I could lead it, and Representative Hernandez was going to focus on particularly folks who English is not a first language and maybe limited English speaking or reading voters. And I know that he and Representative Fahey have talked about that a little bit, and perhaps I would introduce Representative Fahey next, and we'll come back around for other kinds of questions. Representative District 14, am I right? Mm-hmm. Good. West Eugene and Junction City, and has been in the past treasurer of the Democratic Party of Oregon, a partner with the party in thousands of different ways, and was kind enough to step in, and perhaps if you want to carry on from what Samantha was talking about in terms of reaching out to voters of other ethnicities, and particularly have questions about how we keep data and how we can get to the place where we could keep data.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I am happy to fill in for Representative Hernandez today, although I'm sure he would do a much better job. Full disclosure, I did not sleep very well last night, and in fact woke up at about 5:30, and so today was going to be my nap time right now. That's what I'm talking about voting rights, which is great. It's something I'm very excited about. So there's 4 things that I'd like to talk about. Elections equity, so access to voting for people who English is not their primary language. Same-day registration. How do we engage people who are automatically registered to vote and make them more likely to vote? And then how do we just generally increase voter participation, particularly amongst young people, women, and people of color? My background, so I was actually just appointed to the Rules Committee in the House, which deals with elections-related issues amongst lots of other things. So this is a relatively new topic area for me, but it's one I'm going to be spending a lot of time on in the next couple of sessions, hopefully. So elections equity. There's a lot that goes on here. One of the issues is identifying who speaks a language other than English. And so there was a bill last session that didn't pass that Rep. Hernandez put forward that would have added on voter registration forms an optional box to put in your preferred language. So that would be one way to collect that data. Another way to collect that data would be, there are other state agencies like DHS and OHA for the Oregon Health Plan, Medicaid, that already collect that language, or that information about preferred language. And if we could somehow share that information with the Elections Division, then we would have better information about who in the state of Oregon would prefer to receive a ballot or voting or election materials in a language other than English. Obviously, there's all kinds of data and privacy issues with that we would need to work out the implementation of that, but the data exists. And then I think in terms of materials, voting materials in languages other than English, there was a bill, Rep. Hernandez also had a bill last session about putting out voters' pamphlets in the top 10 languages spoken in each county. I do think that has a little bit of a challenge in it, because there's not a one-to-one, if I as a candidate write a voters' pamphlet statement, it's not necessarily you feed it into a translator and it spits out what it is in Spanish or what it is in Russian. So there is a little bit of, as a candidate, I might want some control over what my Spanish language statements state. So it introduces some complexity, but the basic idea is, can we have more election materials in languages other than English to increase access to the ballot? I think you briefly touched on this, same-day voter registration. It's sort of complicated in Oregon because we have vote by mail, and also complicated because it would require a constitutional amendment.
And the Rajneeshis messed it up for all of us.
Yes. If you've watched Wild Country, the Netflix documentary, or if you were here.
Yeah. Some of us remember that.
But there's technical challenges as well. So it would require a constitutional amendment, so that means that the voters would need to approve it. And we don't really have polling places, so same-day registration means you would have to go to an elections office to do that. But I think that's important as we're moving forward to increase access to the ballot.
Can I note for me that when the DNC, Democratic National Committee, went through some of their post-2016 How do we feel better about each other's work, and get on the same page with respect to how caucuses are run and how primaries are run. Much of what's adopted in the way of structural change was that for states like ours who have a primary and not a caucus, so we don't have total control all by ourselves about how primaries are run, we are tasked with lobbying for taking the position that folks have as quick and easy access to being registered as possible. And same-day registration is one of the things that the DNC has in fact told states like Oregon, you need to be advocating for, because there really is no other way to make it. And I understand, obviously look through and understand all the challenges that would pose for clerks who used to have to operate these other offices, and we took it all away and said you don't have to do that anymore, you have vote by mail, and now we're going to say you have to do it all, all over again, or some kind of structure. Yeah. I just thought I'd put that.
Yeah, that's great. I actually didn't know that, so
yeah.
that is good context. So one, and I don't know how much you wanted to talk about this later or now, but the idea of engaging people who are automatically registered to vote, is that a thing I should talk about now, or wait?
I think let's get all the issues out on
Okay.
the table. That sounds like a way
So,
to do it.
one of
we
the-
are going to move to campaign finance reform too, so now
Oh,
you'll have
yes.
a city of issues to talk about. So.
Okay. So one of the things we know from the data is that our voter turnout in Oregon is fairly high, right? We have, automatic registration and mail-in ballots, so a lot of people vote in Oregon. For people who are automatically registered to vote, if they register with a party, as a Democrat or a Republican, they are about as likely to vote as someone who is registered to vote in the traditional way. If they did not register with a party, if they're unaffiliated, they are much less likely to cast a ballot. And that's not really surprising, right? If someone is not registered to vote, that means they're probably less likely to be engaged in the political process. We do know that some percentage of those folks do vote, and so Motor Voter has increased participation, even amongst those folks who previously were not registered. But, it's sort of, and then there was an article published on 538 last week. Super. Oh, okay, great. That was super interesting, and it tried to there's now 16 states plus the District of Columbia that have automatic voter registration. And so they tried to look at the data about, okay, how many new voters have been registered? That's great. How many have updated their registration through the automatic voter registration process? Because that's another value, strong value of why we have automatic registration, is it allows addresses to be updated more quickly. And then it looked at the turnout rates between some of the states for which there is data for those automatically registered voters. Turns out Oregon actually is fairly low relative to the states that they looked at. So our automatically registered voters are somewhat less likely to vote than those in other states that have automatic registration. And they talked about...
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry. I'm preparing something to write 538. I was going to say, the 538 article does sort of compare us and reach that conclusion. One of the things that I failed to do when I talked to the reporter at the time is to point out to him that one of the things we did in 2016 was a reach back 2 years for earlier data from the Department of Motor Vehicles. And I think as we move forward, we're going to find that a higher percentage of those registered, that we will meet up with the norm of the rest of the states. But because we were already capturing people who had not only just not registered in the last year, they hadn't registered in 3 years, we hit at that point a pretty less productive group that would turn around and start voting. And that was missing from the article, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I felt like it was important for
So you're going to come to the direction?
I am.
So, and that actually, for me, I ran for office in 2016, and I had contested primary and a contested general, and I knocked on about 7,000 doors. And so and that was the first year that there were automatically registered voters that were voting in the elections. And I talked to a lot of people, of motor voters, at the doors. And a lot of them did not know they were registered to vote. So that is one thing that I think we could do a better job of. We do, in the automatic registration process, you go to the DMV, you're automatically registered. You're sent a card that says you can opt out if you want, for religious or political reasons, or personal reasons. Or you can designate your party. That happens at the time of transaction. So there should be some communication if people look at their mail that says, but I talked to a lot of people who had no idea they were registered. And so there's some conversation about what's the right way to make sure those people know they're registered to vote and to teach them how to vote. And what is the role of government in that process? What is the role of community organizations? And what is the role of, I had a third. Campaigns, exactly. In campaigns, and thank you, Jeanne, in engaging people. And so one thing government could do, the DC sends a postcard to automatically registered voters right before the election to remind them that they're registered to vote. Now, in a place with vote by mail, you sort of feel like maybe getting the ballot in the mail is the reminder that you're registered to vote. But for people who don't know how to vote because they've never been registered, there are people who are like, well, did I get a ballot? What does it look like? And so those many conversations that I've had with people on the doors really were informative to me about how to engage those folks and get them to vote. And recognizing that we're never going to have 100% participation in that group, or even similar to the non-automatically registered. I talked to folks who, for religious reasons, were registered but said they never vote. People who, one gentleman last year, a very memorable interaction door I knocked on was that he was an older gentleman. I talked to him for about 10 minutes, and I thought, oh, okay, I'm going to get him to vote, even though his voting history said he'd not voted. And it finally came out that he said he has trouble reading, and that's why he doesn't vote. And so I tried to sort of say, well, we can come and take you to the Lake County elections, and someone can read you the ballot, and it just was too much of a barrier for him. So, I think being thoughtful about how we can engage those folks as well, who have difficulty reading. So, really, the main point I want to make is I think there's more work to do about engaging those folks who are automatically registered and communicating with them how to vote. I think there's a role for community-based organizations in that as well, for sure. And the final thing I want to talk about is a way to increase participation in elections. Who knows who Celinda Lake is, the pollster? Who's seen her speak before? I love her. She's so great. She did this show, I can't even remember where, but like a year or two ago I saw her speak, and she said, you know what? It's not rocket science. If you want young people to vote, put young people on the ballot.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, that's great. Like that, it's so simple, and it applies in so many. If you want people of color to vote, put people of color on the ballot. I mean, it is so important to have people who look like you on the ballot running to get you have something to vote for. And so this is a little distant from the topic of voting rights, but support organizations like Color Pack, support organizations like Emerge that train women to run for office, and Oregon Labor Candidate School. We mentioned the thing about how there aren't any legislators under 30, and last term I was trying to organize a group of the younger legislators. It's a long story, but there were 6 of us under 40. That's it, out of 90. And part of that is there's some structural challenges in the legislature with, it's a part-time job, it pays $30,000 a year. If you're mid-career, you have to have another job. And so that means that for those of us who are not retired,
even if you're late career.
And having another job is very challenging for those of us, the Tona Sanchez's and the Karen Powers and the Julie Fahey's of the world in the legislature. And so there are some structural things that could help that. The other thing I wanted to address on this topic was Rep. Hernandez did pass a bill this session in coalition with a lot of other folks called the Oregon Voting Rights Act. And what that addressed is the issue of school board, ESD, community college boards. There are many of those organizations in Oregon that have at-large voting. So at-large districts. So you just elect 5, school board members from this school board district. And so in effect, in many places in Oregon, what ends up happening is if there's a pocket of a community of color in one part of that district, it is that much harder for folks from that community to get elected to the board. And so, going to zones or districts is one way to fix that, but The Oregon Voting Rights Act actually created a process for people from communities like that to petition and say, this is resulting in an inequitable outcome, and so we want this process to be changed at the school board, community college, and ESD level. So that was a big win in the legislature to try and get a better representation on school boards. Again, also has the effect of increasing voter engagement and participation, particularly in underrepresented communities. So that was it. That's all I want to talk about, except how you can get involved. This is just sort of a throwaway thing, but on campaigns, last cycle, we did a lot of text banking, which helps to engage younger people because no one wants to answer them. I don't want to answer my phone. Don't ever leave me a voicemail. I will not listen to it. So it helps to engage younger people, but also it was so much fun for me to do as a volunteer. On election night, I don't think anyone here in the room was with me on election night. Maybe Emily was. I don't know. I was getting texts from people at 7 o'clock. Like, I didn't get my ballot. Can you help me? Like, do this. And so I'm furiously testing people. You can go to the elections, division and still pick up a ballot. And I had someone text me back and say, oh, thanks. I got there. They had it waiting for me. I ordered it in advance. They had it waiting for me. I filled it out and I turned it in. So like very one-on-one direct hand-holding of here is actually how you vote. And I think it's so much more today. It's so much easier to do that by text than it is by phone in a lot of ways. So anyway, if you can get plugged into a campaign next year that does text banking, it's a lot of fun.
Hold on.
Go
So
ahead.
since Rep. Fahey mentioned putting young people on the ballot and young people of color on the ballot, I would be remiss not to give a shout out to Next Up board member and Washington County House candidate, Winsve Campos. She is on track to become our youngest state legislator ever. She's 23 right now. She'll be 24 when she is sworn in. I was going to say inaugurated. It does feel like a coronation though, because I love her so much that I call her Win Bay. And I recommend that you get involved and support her, especially if you're in Washington County, but even if you're not.
Full service panel here with all kinds of good things. Well, I want to get our final big issue that we haven't talked about on the table, and I want to give Tony a chance to talk about what he and Representative Rayfield and a multitude of others I know have been working on in terms of campaign finance reform. Because of course we know that sort of concern and disgust and cynicism about our system is also one of the things that keeps people from voting or feeling that their vote is worthwhile. And because we have started down a path now in Oregon, kind of a big leap from where we've been up to this point, we thought that was really important. But I want to give him a proper introduction. Tony is from our blue state wall here on the West Coast, both California and Alaska, and now in Oregon. Attended Humboldt State University with degrees in kinesiology and political science. So I think texting and kinesiology work together. Tony went on to earn his master's in public health. Those are my favorite people in the world because they rely on data to make policy at Oregon State. And he began as he was at Oregon State working for Representative Dan Rayfield as his legislative director. Recent work with Representative Rayfield includes passing 2 bills and a legislative referral to regulate campaign contributions and shine a light on dark money in politics. So here's Tony.
Thank you, Jeanne. I think it's a little jaw-dropping to 1, again, be on a panel with Jeanne Atkins, and then 2, be expected to follow Samantha and Representative Fahey. I don't know why I drew the short straw to go last, but that works. Change things up a little bit, finally. So, like Jeanne mentioned, my main role with Dan Rayfield is as his legislative director, and so I get to do a lot of everything, which in this last session involved working with a large coalition to figure out a way to regulate the money in campaigns. Basically, some background is that since I believe it was 1974 was the last time we had any regulation of campaign finance in the state, and that was on how much candidates could spend. They could still take in $1 million from, I don't know, somebody with Nike, but they could only spend X amount. That was then ruled unconstitutional, so the legislature's last action regarding campaign finance was to repeal those laws. Since then, we've been entirely inactive when it comes to even trying to regulate campaign finance. The kind of interesting thing is that to pass revenue reform in Oregon, you need a 3/5 vote. We've done that multiple times since 1974, but we haven't been able to pass campaign finance, which only actually requires a simple majority, so 50% plus one vote. However, with the growing momentum from, I think everybody probably remembers our last governor's race, where there was multiple $1 million checks being written in on both sides, to be fair, from multiple different organizations, and the amount, I think in the 2016, if folks know in the room, feel free to correct me, but I think it was around 38 million, some very large amount. And previous to that, the largest race, or the most expensive race, I believe, was around $17 million. So it's on an exponential path, and it's just not sustainable, and it's not representative of everyday Oregonians. People aren't able to give, I wish I was able to give $1 million, but that's not representative of everyday Oregonians. So trying to create a system that empowers everyday Oregonians to be able to feel like if they're supporting a candidate, that candidate's actually listening to them. They're actually bought into what that individual donor's perspectives are, and they care about those people, instead of the multi-million-dollar large corporations that are able to come in, drop $1 million checks, and even though the Supreme Court doesn't view it this way, but to be able to buy that time, buy that influence, and be able to influence and shape the policies that legislators are passing in Salem or in DC or any state government for that matter. So with that momentum from 2016, Representative Rayfield has always, quite frankly, been very passionate about campaign finance reform. And now we finally have the momentum behind us to bring other folks in the room, figure out bills that we could pass to at least start to make a difference in the system. So we brought together a group of, I think, around 40-ish people and organizations, representing a broad spectrum of folks that care about elections. I don't know. Like, pretty sure next step was there, but I don't remember. Sorry. So with that group, we were working on primarily 4 bills. One that was a constitutional referral that you all will actually have the ability to vote on in this upcoming 2020 November election.
Vote yes.
Yes, please vote yes. To amend our Constitution, because the Supreme Court's current interpretation of the Constitution is that the legislature and the initiative process cannot, in Oregon, place limits on campaign finance. So we need to fix that before we can put in limits. So that was one of the bills that we worked on, passed out of both chambers, and is heading to you on a ballot soon. And then the other 3 bills were, one, a campaign finance limits bill that didn't pass, but we'll get to that later. Another bill that puts Oregon in line and better than federal regulations that requires paid for by statements on campaign ads. Because unfortunately, Oregon cannot currently require candidates to make that statement. So any ads that you see, this ad was paid for by friends of Julie Fahey, those are all optional things. So candidates are not required to do that. So if you remember the Kate Brown storybook ad, there was no explicit statement that was required on that ad to say who paid for it. Now, however, there will be, and they'll have to say this ad was paid for by Priority Oregon, and their top 5 donors are 1 through 5. So it sheds a little bit deeper light to where you can see, oh, this is some really offensive information, but it's actually coming from some really uncredible sources. So giving voters that opportunity to have a little bit better understanding of who's trying to influence their votes. And then the 4th bill was a quote-unquote dark money bill. In Oregon, we don't have super PACs per se because we don't necessarily need them, because, as we'll talk about in a second, there's no limits on campaign finance. However, to get even deeper into hiding who's paying for what, organizations can funnel their money through nonprofits. So 501c4s and c6s can spend money in campaigns, and no one's able to know who those donors are until now, where we passed a bill that would require, if Next Up C4 was bringing in millions and millions and millions of dollars and supporting Representative Fahey, they would have to disclose any of their donors over a certain threshold. So we're able to structure the bill to where it only gets at large donors and only organizations that are contributing a significant amount into campaigns, to not overly burden a lot of the organizations that are doing a lot of great get out the vote grassroots campaigns. We didn't want to stifle that work, but we did want to get at the organizations that are bringing in millions of dollars, dumping it into campaigns, influencing voters, and nobody's able to know where that money's coming from. So shining a light on that sector of dark money. So the limits bill that I'm sure you all are on the edges of your seats to hear about didn't pass. We were able to pass it out of the House with support of all of the great representatives that are in the room. However, with the eventful end of session that I'm sure we all remember, we were not able to get enough consensus over in the Senate as to how the bill would actually work to get it moved out. Representative Rayfield and I traveled the state we're in October now, in September, to do town halls and provide information to folks about what campaign finance is, how it works, and then get feedback to know how much do you think an individual should be able to give to a candidate. Should it be unlimited? Should it be $1 million? Should it be $100? To get that feedback to then influence and inform a bill that we'll introduce in the 2020 session, and fingers crossed, maybe it can make it out of both chambers next time. The biggest issue is that we're going from a system with no regulations. Candidates and campaigns are able to operate however they want and bring in as much money as they can, because you need a lot of money to communicate with voters. The issue becomes, how do we communicate with the folks that are voting on this bill to regulate themselves, to honestly make a lot of campaigns' jobs a little bit harder? If you can bring in $1 million check, that's one phone call, maybe a couple meetings. But if you have to bring in $100 or $1,000 checks, that's a lot more work and a lot more time for a campaign. So how do we structure a bill that still allows campaigns to still function, still communicate with voters, still connect with their community, get their message out, and hopefully win, while not allowing those $1 million checks that tip the scales catastrophically, quite frankly, in one direction. So it's really complicated. A lot of folks have a lot of different ideas on it. Across the state was no surprise that folks were all the way from money is speech, we need to embrace free speech and it should not be regulated at all, to you shouldn't receive any money from any individual person and we should have only public financing. So all the way across the spectrum, and now Representative Rayfield's job is to figure out how to find that happy medium, that porridge that everybody likes, and hopefully get a bill passed to create a better electoral system. Because I think one of the interesting things to me was that Osprey, Oregon Public Interest Group did a study a few years ago, I think, and did interviews with candidates. And a lot of candidates that wanted to run for office, like the young folks, the people of color that are never or very rarely on our ballots, don't run because of the system that we have. Because when you learn, if I'm gonna run a state representative campaign, I have to somehow raise, how much your raise generally is?
Like 250 in 2016.
Yeah, 250?
250,000.
Oh, I thought dollars.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so everywhere from a very,
Absurd.
like a moderately competitive race, a $250,000 race, to Representative Jeanne Bynum, who that race runs upwards of $1 million. So you have to raise $1 million or more to represent 60,000 people. It's just not really, and then you also going into a job where you get paid very minimum. So tagging on to Representative Fahey's comments. So it's just, if one doesn't allow the representatives to have equal face time with candidate or with donors, because you're forced, honestly, to shift to higher dollar donors. And then two, it limits the folks that are actually willing to put their name on the ballot, because as a 28-year-old person of color in Corvallis, there's no way I could raise that amount of money from my friends. So that in and of itself is very intimidating and would not make me not want to run for office because I personally don't have the resources, and a lot of candidates I think across the state would share that sentiment. If we could get a campaign finance limit system in place, I think not automatically, but over time, we would have a more representative democracy and have better legislation coming out because you have people looking at it from all different lenses, and I think that is what would truly strengthen our democracy.
Somebody who does candidate recruiting, I can say, it's a huge barrier.
Yeah.
No one wants, I mean, it's the worst part of being an elected official, is raising money, for sure. And so when I'm trying to convince people to run for the legislature, when I'm trying to convince people to run for the legislature, people always ask that question, is what does it look like to have to fundraise? So if we could somehow fix that.
So, yes, we're working on it, yeah. I think to leave time for questions, that's all I've got.
Wonderful, and yeah, I do want to get some dialogue going here, and I want to remind everybody we've covered a lot of ground, and you might have had questions on an earlier subject, so think about automatic voter registration and changes and possible ways that we change our registration rules. Think about campaign finance. Think about education and outreach and who does it and how they do it. Those are all things that have been raised here. I hoped before we finish with campaign finance right now, if we could talk just a minute, because I'm sure for some folks it's messy in their heads. It's always messy in mine. We in Oregon have this constitutional interpretation that our state constitution's First Amendment rights, we can't limit either spending on campaigns or giving in campaigns. But we also have Citizens United. And when we change our state constitution and do our limits, if I understand correctly, and I think I do, Citizens United, a Supreme Court decision, will not allow us to implement as to yeah. So if you want to talk about that a little bit, because I do think those two things converge. And one of the things I know that the party, as we engaged in this discussion and tried to think about how it would affect us, if they don't have to mind these rules, but we put them on our candidates or on our parties, is there a vulnerability about, will we have them super PACs who will come and do it?
So, thank you.
Yeah.
One of the things that the Campaign Finance Reform Task Force in 2015 and 2016 that I believe you were the chair of, one of the things—
I went to the French Open and took a vacation, and they made me chair of this campaign. And when she was making faces about being in the coalition that Representative Rayfield started, it was the same 40 people, and they don't get along, so it's not the happiest table.
It is a group of very opinionated cats to try to herd, and so I envy the job that you did. And one of the things that they looked at was, of states that do have limits, because I think Oregon right now is one of the last 5 or 6 states that doesn't have any limits. So we're pretty behind the trend on limiting money coming into campaigns. And one of the things that the Campaign Finance Task Force looked at is the lower the limits are, the higher the independent expenditures are. And so just what independent expenditures are is, if I support Representative Fahey and I'm a pretty taboo person, maybe she doesn't like me, her community doesn't like me, but I still really want her to win for whatever reason, even though she doesn't want me to be associated with her, which is kind of weird. I thought we got along. I would do an independent expenditure. So I have $1 million, I run a TV ad, I send mailers to her voters talking up how great Representative Fahey is, but it doesn't go to her. I can't communicate with her. She can't tell me, well, I want you to say this, this, and this. I want you to use this messaging. This is what my polling says. You should use this, or you should talk to these voters. So that's the independent part. So I'm spending money on her behalf, independent of her campaign. If we put a limit on to where I could only give Representative Fahey $1,000, I could still give her that $1,000. But if I'm sitting with $1 million that I want to give to her, I'm not just gonna go sit at home and hope for the best in her campaign. I'm gonna go out and spend that, whatever the math is, $1 million minus 1,000 on her campaign through an independent expenditure. And under Citizens United, we can't regulate that. well, shouldn't say that. We can't limit the independent expenditures. We can shine a light on where that money is coming from, who it's being used by, which is part of what the bill that Representative Rayfield passed, or the legislature passed, to say this ad was paid for by Tony Lapiz, or friends of Julie, maybe super friends of Julie Fahey, and our top 5 donors are these 5 people. And if that's just me, or me and some of my friends, or other associates that want to help Representative Fahey, but can't give $11,000. So it's really complicated. It's almost like if you have a jar with some holes in it and you dump water in it, the water's going to flow somewhere. So all we can do is try to plug as many of the holes as we can. And if we can't plug all of the holes, we need to highlight where that water is coming from. And if it's good, great. You shouldn't be ashamed of highlighting it. But if it's taboo, if it's maybe oil money or tobacco money or pharma money that your voters don't like, then we're going to tell them that this is the organization and these are the people that are paying for that. And so yeah, we can limit some things, but also until the Supreme Court changes, which based on things federally, I'm not holding my breath that that will happen anytime soon. So the most that we can do is try to inoculate against that and shine as much of a light as we can.
So, any of the topics? And in the back.
So my name is John Wickham. I'm from Beaverton Education Association, board member for BEA with OEA PAC. But you know, I'm becoming an older guy here. I've heard campaign finance reform all of my life, and I just don't see much happening. And I agree, it's a problem. But what I'm thinking is, what about just educating voters on, like Orstar, or educating voters about how money is messing up your relationship with your legislator or whatever. And I think back to Russ Feingold, who was a champion of campaign finance reform. And you know, I remember him. I'm from Iowa, so he's Wisconsin, and he made it a point to say, I do not take large contributions from PACs or big business. And I think that helped him for a while. You mentioned the lost, I think. But what do you guys think about that? I mean, just maybe, you know, I'm sorry, I'm a little skeptical on changing campaign finance reform because the people that are in power are the ones who are getting the money.
Oh yeah.
So why would they vote against it?
Yeah, thanks for that, John. I felt that skepticism this session where I was like, oh, seriously, the cats are coming together again for like the 50th time? Okay. Tell me when it's about to pass, right? Like all these bills were precariously dangling on the path to pass. Yeah, it happened, right? But, you know, to the point about educating people about Orstar, oh my gosh, right now the Secretary of State website, it's so glitchy. Sometimes I go to register or check my registration, register someone else, and it kicks me to Orstar. Sometimes I'm in Orstar and it kicks me somewhere. So to that point, we definitely need technology upgrades for Orstar for it to even become an interface that young people want to use or could check on their phones.
And I think it's important, and I think the level of transparency we have in Oregon is great, and you know, the reporters all the time are looking on Orstar to see who the top donors are, and it's great. It's not enough. I mean, when I ran in 2016, I was outspent by 50% in my primary and in my general. And it was like, it was so hard to sort of see a $10,000 check come in on the other side and know how many phone calls I was going to have to make that money. I mean, $50, you know, it's a lot of $50 contributions. And so just the fact that one donor, I mean, we obviously saw it writ large in the governor's race with Phil Knight, but even at the state legislative level, it's such a barrier. But yeah, so we need to have campaign contribution limits. And the challenge, as Tony said, is that you put in contribution limits, and then did you squeeze the balloon and it pops out over here, and so then the money's still going to be there. I think it still helps to have the money over here instead of directly in a candidate's PAC, but yeah, so not enough. Necessary but not sufficient.
Julie.
Yeah. Hi, Rex Burkholder, and a question about the Voting Rights Act, I believe it was, about how does the process work in terms of challenging at-large elections? And is it automatic that all districts have to change, or is this something that has to be petitioned by their residents?
So it's not automatic. I have the one pager right here because it's a little complicated.
Maybe you could text it to me.
Okay. Well,
Yeah,
actually,
but-
do you want to talk about it or?
No, I'm
It's
just
not
really
automatic.
curious.
Yeah.
How
Do you have a card? And
Yes.
Rep Fahey can send that to
Sure.
you while we do this, but it's not automatic, and a community or individual needs to first notice the problem is happening, and then they're able to make a complaint or an argument to their local jurisdiction, and then the local jurisdiction has a set amount of time to react to that. They need to acknowledge it and then propose some solutions. And the idea is that the community and the jurisdiction work together to figure out what a solution is. So it's not quite as cumbersome. It does open up way to a lawsuit if the jurisdiction does not reasonably work within this, but there is some ability. You're gonna go over it?
Yeah. So school districts and these boards can choose to voluntarily reform their election methods to comply with the Oregon Voting Rights Act. So that's one path. If an elector from a protected class that lives in the qualifying district can also file a notice, which is what Samantha was saying, it must be in writing, yada yada, propose a remedy to cure the violation. That district has 90 days to respond to the notice until an elector can proceed with a legal action in circuit court. So that's the basic idea. Is it requires
so it
someone
doesn't
to.
necessarily mean that they would move to geographically
there
based
could be a different
district.
solution.
Yeah, there can be a variety. So it opens up local jurisdictions to do anything from try out ranked choice voting to establishing districts, right? It's pretty cool. It allows completely locally driven solutions. However, it is limited to school districts because of a
Yeah.
home rule piece.
Yeah.
So it doesn't apply to city council.
Right. No, my concern is I served on a voting rights panel underneath the Federal Voting Rights Act, and
What?
just the stories that came. Well, the one I remember is Yakima, which had a majority Latino population and 0 Latinos on any governing board at all,
Mm-hmm.
and all the petitions and all the requests and all that kind of stuff. Why change? It meant sharing power, and they had to be slammed with a federal suit to do it, which takes huge resources, and they had to get national help to make it happen. So my concern with, if people don't do things just because they're told it's not a good thing, especially when it's given up power. I'm
So wondering where are the teeth in this
Well,
one?
I'm interested in whether there is a campaign or a group coming together statewide to go and actually, here's a model, here's ways you can do it, and avoid being sued, et cetera, and make it so that it isn't just individual people who don't have many resources who say, we'd like to see a change happen, and get ignored.
Yeah,
Or have to go to court.
the Oregon Voting Rights Act Coalition is continuing to work on how to take it to the next level, and would love your input. So I'd love to get your card too. But there is a home rule issue when it comes to extending it to bigger districts.
And I'm standing up because I wanted to make sure.
Yeah, I know
see
Julie
No, great.
had
No,
her
thank you very much.
See hands, so.
Okay, well, I'm glad I came to this one. This is great. Good job, guys. I like this. Oh, I'm Julie Clark-Bush. I'm with the Voter Journey people. And I'm obsessed with the voter journey. And I loved your stories about knocking on the door and educating the non-affiliated motor voter people. And I have ideas on how to engage that group, but I need a list. Is that list available, and can I have it?
Yeah, it's publicly available. So through our the Voter Activation Network, which is the voter list that we in the Democratic Party use. When I go canvassing on my phone or my tablet, we have it set up so that it's actually tagged which voters are motor voter, and I can see, if they have voted in the past, I can see their voter history and all that. So I know when I'm knocking on doors who's motor voter and who's not.
I'd also add that Indivisible has a project right now called the Purple People Project, where they are looking to connect with non-affiliated voters registered through automatic voter registration. So I highly recommend that you connect with them. I heard about it from someone in Southern Oregon, in Ashland. So I don't know if it's statewide. Looking around for Indivisible people.
But our voter lists start with the list from the Secretary of State's office, and the data is kept in such a way that you can both know who's a non-affiliated voter and whether they were registered through motor voter or not. So those lists are available. I want to mention one thing about educating voters,
Well, and don't you,
especially
can't anybody get those from each county?
Yeah.
well, sometimes no. Yeah.
Well, they can in Washington.
Yes,
They
they
can in
can in
Washington
Washington
County.
County.
And
And
I
I will
love
do
it.
it. Yes.
Yeah, for neighborhood
Yes.
leaders, when we walk our neighborhood, it's all labeled as to who's voted before and who's motor voter and who's not affiliated.
Yeah, but anybody can go to the Washington County Elections Office and get a copy of the voters list.
Can they really?
Yes.
Yeah, Secretary of State on their website will tell you how to get voter lists, and you can go through clerk's offices as well. It's all be a little faster and easier than others. I just wanted to mention, because we talked about particularly folks coming out of the penal system. In Oregon, as long as you're not in jail, you can vote if once you have served your time. And when I was Secretary of State, we did on a voter registration day. One of the things I did that particular day was meet with a group of folks at a service that was providing services to folks coming out of the prison system, and we did a little bit of a focus group and talked about it. And it's amazing what you learn. This was not, there were people there who were not intimidated by the fact that they had served time. I mean, there were some people for whom they didn't feel they deserved to vote. They were still recovering in many ways, from this process. But what they said more than anything else is, what if I make a mistake? This looked to them, those ballots look to them like a test in school.
Yeah.
And if I screw this up and make a mess, I'm gonna get in trouble, and I don't need it. I don't need to have that problem. Something that I took away with me. So, very important. So, there was one other person over here, but then Jamie?
A question on campaign finance. Is it possible to create a volunteer system that has incentives? So I served on a city council where we essentially had, and we're able to establish an upper level, but if people voluntarily accepted a lower cap, the city then provided sent out information to voters, very generic, but for those who opted into this program, they got other incentives from the city, so it was that incentive to do it, but is that
so it's one thing that we've worked on and actually passed in Portland recently. I think their next city council races are gonna be
It's happening right now.
right now. They have a small donor match program that Representative Rayfield introduced, I think for the first time in 2017, 2015.
Just to clarify, it's not a match, so
Right,
it doesn't
yeah,
allow you to do
so-
anything. The city or the jurisdiction would send out its own, but it's essentially that voter contact
Right.
piece, but it's.
So, I mean, we already have voters pamphlet statements, so I wouldn't know what a local government or even a state government
Here's
would
an
be able to
example. City of Beaverton does have its own voters pamphlet in addition to the county insert, but they could waive the fee for the city councilors who pledge to do that.
Or the city just pays for a separate flyer that goes out to everyone that has everyone listed with basic information.
Right, so I think with that, you would run into a lot of issues with that incentive wouldn't really offset going down to a lower cap. So if I'm a candidate and I opt into a volunteer program where I'm self-imposing, say even $1,000 cap on how much I can accept from any individual, and the city or the state sends out a slate card effectively, that to me as a candidate isn't going to outweigh, if I'm running against Rep. Fahey, the fact that then she could still opt out and accept $1 million check. And then my communication is only tiered by one mailer.
Well, you
That's
gotta balance the incentive.
Right, so that's why we've drafted a small donor match program, which is public financing, self-opting into voluntarily to a $250 limit, and then you receive a public match of 6-1. So that, at least in our opinion and research by other states and local governments that have done it, is enough to say, well, if I'm running in Samantha and she's not gonna do this program, she's gonna take $1 million checks, I don't have the resources to call a $1 million donor, but I do have resources to call $100, $250 donors. That gets matched 6-1, which then allows me to at least be competitive. I'm probably not gonna outspend her, but I can at least be competitive with that match opting into this program. And they've done it in states like, or in city races like Portland, close to home. New York City's done it, and some other states have done a similar public match program. And we drafted it. Seattle has
their vouchers.
Yeah, they have their vouchers program. So there's a lot of different options for public financing. The growing trend is with a public match, and that's why we've tried to push it over the hill several times, and will continue to do so, because the research shows that this gets, one, more diverse donors. The more diverse donors you get, the more committed they are to actually turn out and vote, and the more diverse candidates you get running for office. So it kind of hits on every single issue to strengthen our democracy, but it requires a little bit of money from the public side. And advocating that we spend our general fund dollars, your taxpayer dollars, on Representative Fahey and Representative Sanchez's campaigns, rather than in the schools with your children, is a difficult argument to make. While I think there are arguments that if we do spend money in campaigns, get more diverse candidates, we'll have better policies coming out to better the schools that your children are in an upstream perspective, but it's difficult to sell to the legislature and honestly the voters that this is a worthwhile upstream investment. But hopefully someday we'll get there. Hopefully someday soon.
We have only about a minute and a half left, so. Catherine.
Hello, my name is Catherine Harrington. I'm the elected chair of the Washington County Board of Commissioners, and before that, I served with this fine gentleman on the Metro Council.
Don't blame me.
Yes. Well, it was an honor, and he was helpful. So I have two things. I love Orstar. I love having open campaign contribution filing systems here. But I have two things before you address. The first one is, if you're working on campaign finance reforms, in both of my entrees into these positions, they're nonpartisan positions, but I was in a primary where at least 4 of us were running, and then I was in a runoff through November. And I think there is an advantage if you increase the reporting deadlines so that over 6 months beforehand, they're required to report not just once a month, but every 2 weeks, and advance that schedule. I think that would help with a lot of visibility.
We tried to make them report every month, every week, no matter what time of the year.
Great, thank you. I wasn't sure of that with the bills you were talking about. Secondly, I'm a little tired, fatigued at the $1 million example. I've been working hard for over 10 years now to get more women and people of color to run in local elected positions, school boards, park districts, city councils, and just examples of being compared to City of Portland. We're blessed to have one humongous city in our state, City of Portland. But for the propensity of positions in local government that I have helped other candidates, some of the ideas you're talking about are great, but I would hope that when you look at legislation, someone will do serious homework. Feel free to pull a lot of us activists at the local level in to go over the spreadsheets and see what the access problems are versus perpetuate these $1 million examples over and over and over again. And that's when both of these primary and runoffs that I've had have required me to raise and invest over $225,000 each time.
So one of the things that we've tried to get at is one, and thank you very much for your comments. we wanted to increase reporting requirements and shorten the timelines. That way voters can be more informed that, oh,
great.
there's this big mailer that just went out, but we're not gonna know who paid for that for another month. And I don't really think that that is, it's good that we have Warstar, but we can obviously increase that transparency. And two, with one, putting in limits gets rid of the $1 million donors, kind of, with the independent expenditure exception. And two, we've also been trying to figure out other ways to create better opportunities for candidates to get their voices out there, whether it's a publicly funded website where it has everybody's effectively voters pamphlet statement with hyperlinks to where I can see Representative Fahey's information. I could click here, go to her Warstar, click here, go to her voting history, click here and do those things, to where the electorate can be informed without the campaign having to raise that money to get that information out there. We've also been trying to think of creative ideas for a lot of folks that we met with across the state have wanted a publicly funded television channel where only candidate ads are put on a loop on that channel and not on your everyday so it would save a lot of money for candidates buying time on
that'll be a part of
Nobody would see it.
Wouldn't it be wonderful?
General public.
So
I wanna actually just ban TV ads, political TV ads, because that's I mean, I don't know what percentage of my budget was, but it was a lot. And so, and Jeanne, for sure. So, anyway, I don't know if that's constitutional, but.
From that, and they will definitely speak up. Taxing them, you know, having some sort of a sales tax on campaign ads that gets paid by the TV stations back to the campaigner might be something. Anyway, obviously other panels are breaking up and new ones are going to start. I want to thank our panelists, particularly Julie, for jumping in. But this was a great. You can see we've got some really great minds and open minds thinking about all of the things that are important to be done, and I really can be nobody anymore, and you guys will be the panelists that people will be vying to be sitting next to. So thank you all for coming.